awesome to see so many familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces. A little bit about me to get started. I kind of came to photography through science. I was studying biology and geology in undergrad, and increasingly started getting interested in the overlap between science and photography and like visual communication. So it's been this kind of thread that has grown with me of like, how do you capture scientific ideas and like the scientific story underlying places and landscapes. And so, yeah, this is a show that I pulled together about one of my favorite subjects in the world, which is river systems, and specifically the Colorado River, which I grew up in Denver, and citizens of Denver drink Colorado River water every day from their tap, and the Colorado River really shapes a huge portion of life in the Western United States. As part of one of my kind of many expeditions to like take some pictures of cool stuff, I took, mostly in November 2021, I took a long trip down the length of the Colorado River, mostly by car, seeing what I could see and trying to track down some of what I thought are really interesting stories. So these photos are mostly taken during that trip, and they range roughly from the very top of the Colorado River watershed at the headwaters of some of its tributaries, all the way down to near its delta in the Gulf of California. And so this is the story underlying some of those photos. And in general, a concept that has guided a lot of my work and something that I am really interested in the field of science communication is this idea of scientific X-ray vision, which is basically my shorthand for the way that understanding the science underlying something, or like what's kind of going on within something, gives you this like added view beneath the surface of it that I think is really cool, and it kind of adds to the richness and depth of an experience of a landscape or a phenomenon or an organism. So my goal for this artist talk was basically to go through all of these photos that are here on the wall and try and get at some of that X-ray vision and some of what I see beneath the surface in these photos. And I'll be going not chronologically, so on the wall here they're roughly displayed from top to bottom of the actual river itself, but I've kind of bunched these photos in a different way according to some of the like categories or phenomena that I think that they represent. And this first part of the show is all about how rivers function in the natural world and how those natural river processes have shaped the American West. And one more kind of housekeeping thing, every time that there's a photo that was actually in the show displayed, you'll see these kind of this like line and number set up, just because there will be a lot of other photos interspersed, just so that it's clear like which photos we're talking about. Throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing both photos that are actually already in the show, but also a lot of other photos that I've taken along the way that help illustrate those concepts, some of the diagrams and drawings that I use as an illustrator, and also a few captures from my newfound habit of perusing Google Earth to find like other satellite views of really cool landscapes. But everything in this presentation will be also my work. And this is the first photo in this presentation because to me this really represents the birth of rivers. The headwaters of rivers are where rivers get their start both spatially and materially. So the headwaters of tributaries to the Colorado River, this is the East River in Colorado, near Crested Butte, Colorado. Basically all of the water that falls on the western side of the Rocky Mountains will make its way into one of these tributaries, and eventually these tributaries all flow together into the main stream of the Colorado River. What that means is that if you go just on the other side of this ridge in the distance and pour a glass of water on the ground or have a rainstorm, that water will be ending up in the Mississippi River, not in the Colorado. So the headwaters of the Colorado are really the starting point of what can be defined that watershed and the place where that river collects its material from. And on that subject, they're also the start of these rivers materially because this is where the majority of the water actually comes from. The Rocky Mountains in particular in relation to the Colorado River are really serve this role as like year-round water tower. 80% of the water that ultimately ends up in the river starts as snow in the Rockies, which is kind of different from a lot of other rivers which have like a substantial input of rain or kind of collecting water along their length. In the case of the Colorado River, in part because so much of the land it traverses between the Rockies and the Gulf of California is desert, almost all of that water starts as snow in the Rockies. And then the second thing that I think is really interesting about this photo that made it a good starting point for this talk is the squiggliness of this river. And the squiggles have a technical term, which is meanders. River meanders have this really cool role, in my opinion, as being kind of like a microcosm of the processes that rivers as a whole enact on the landscapes that they flow through. So what you're seeing here is basically just a straight down view of that same river you were just seeing in the other photo. And you can see that as this river flows around these curves, it interacts with the landscape differently. So as it goes around the outside of the curve, the water is speeding up, and that added momentum and speed is giving it the energy required to lift up and carry and erode away sediments. On the inside of the curves, the opposite is happening. The water is slowing down, and it's losing energy, it's losing the ability to keep sediments in its currents, and those sediments are falling out and creating new land at the inside of these bends. And the result of this, combined with the fact that these rivers are getting this kind of constant influx of new sediments being created by the steep headwaters upstream, is that these rivers are constantly building up the land beneath them and really building their way out of their own bed. So this river, as it lays down more and more sediments on the inside of these curves, will migrate laterally, and over time, these bends have this effect of pushing rivers laterally across landscapes. So we think of rivers as mostly linear, but ultimately, on a big enough time scale, and especially in the case of these meandering rivers that flow mostly over flat ground, they really move laterally to an amazing extent. So this is a satellite image that I took from Google Earth of some random river in Mongolia, but it's kind of hard to see the scale bar here, but the amazing thing about this is that you can tell that in the relatively recent past, probably a couple years or decades, this river has moved laterally more than a mile. So you can see here the traces of the old path that it has taken, and as it deposits sediment in its old bed, it no longer is occupying the lowest point in the landscape, and so it'll totally reroute. And so you really get this effect of like rivers kind of acting like a loose fire hose, where they're like squiggling all over the place, constantly kind of moving themselves laterally across the landscape. And when you zoom even further out to a like broad landscape scale, you get this amazing effect where pretty much everything on Earth is either an erosional environment, like these mountains. So this is the foothills of the Himalayas in northern India and Bangladesh as they drain into the Brahmaputra River. So you either get erosional environments like these mountains, or you get these depositional meandering river environments like here. And you can see how these are just like squiggling all over the landscape, laying down new material, and ultimately ending up in this massive river, which itself is carrying all of that material out into its delta. It's dumping it in the Bay of Bengal, which is one of the biggest sediment shelves in the world. There's more than 20 kilometers of accumulated sediment from these mountains, and it is very literally building up the land that we live on. So I see all of that in this photo. And this is a really cool space because for the most part mountain environments are erosional, but the East River is really unusual because it has these really easily eroded hillsides that create this kind of microcosm environment where you get a deposition within an erosional environment. Now, the second photo in the show is kind of the other side of the coin of how water and river processes interact with life, and that is the effect that life itself has on those rivers. So obviously, building up and eroding the surface of our landscapes is a huge influence that life plays on rivers, but there's a lot of give and take. And this photo looks pretty similar in some ways to that other photo. In fact, it's taken just a couple miles away, also in crested view, on a neighboring drainage called the Slate River. And even though this looks like a river meander, in fact, it probably was at some point, and the river moved, this is actually a beaver pond. So this is another view on that same beaver pond. And beavers really are these fantastic creatures because other than us, which I will get to later, they enact more change upon rivers than really any other organism. And those changes have so many far-reaching effects that I think are a really good illustration of all the processes at play here. So this is a really simple drawing that I did as part of a whole project I did about how cool beavers are. This is basically just a normal river, and the cross-section here is to show you a little bit about what's going on underneath the surface. So rivers, as you guys all know, are just water moving over the land. But one interesting thing that a lot of people don't think about is groundwater. And that is basically just that when water lands on the earth and it soaks into it, rather than running off across the surface of it, that water goes somewhere. And that is basically, it goes as far down as it can until it hits a saturated zone, where all of the pore space and the cracks and all of the just little cavities in the soil are filled with water. And so that area, that saturated zone, is called the water table. And in a normal situation, it roughly parallels the land surface, usually meeting up with the river at the lowest point in the land. When a beaver comes along and builds a dam, you get this added hydraulic head, which is just a word for how much weight, or how much height of water there is, and that height of water creates weight that pushes more water into the ground. And that has the effect of dramatically changing where the water table lies in the landscape. So the water table will grow, there will be more exchange between rivers and the underlying groundwater, and when that happens, you have this huge increase in something called hypereic exchange, which is basically the effect of groundwater and surface water mingling, which causes all of this interchange of nutrients and microbially processed like pollutants and oxygen and dissolved gases. Basically, a huge percentage of what rivers are and what they carry on their currents is influenced by the fact that they're constantly in exchange with the actual ground itself. The action of beavers also creates this huge amount of diversity and heterogeneity in these environments. So you have more habitat for fish and other things that live in this ecosystem, and you have a huge increase in the amount of water available to plants. Another thing that isn't necessarily well illustrated by the beaver example, but a central role that rivers play in facilitating life is that they deliver the nutrients that are essential to life on Earth. So as rivers create sediments and they break down those rocks, the kind of weak acid that is in water as a result of it dissolving carbon dioxide out of the air, dissolves minerals out of those rocks. And those minerals include things like calcium, zinc, phosphorus, iron, all of these things that you are familiar with seeing on the back of the nutrition label, because that is the source of those minerals and vitamins and minerals. These nutrients that are dissolved by rivers and delivered throughout the landscape are really the building blocks of life. And things like this in a natural, healthy river ecosystem make those minerals more accessible. So together, I think these two photos provide a cool kind of intro to just how rivers shape life on Earth today and constantly. And with that, I want to look into the past a little bit. So in the second section, I guess first I'll tell you a little bit about this photo. This is a picture of one of the buttes in Monument Valley, and I took this as I was driving through the desert, getting absolutely pelted by an insanely intense rainstorm. And so the dark background you can see here is the retreating hind end of an insane thundercloud that had just passed through the area. All these rocks were recently doused and they were glistening and vibrantly red. And the sun had just peeked through and it was this insane dramatic moment. But I like this photo scientifically, and I think it captures with this really beautiful detail and color, it captures the fact that all of these rocks that are kind of central to the iconic landforms of the American West are themselves sedimentary rocks. And what that means is that they've all been formed by this whole process of rivers eroding and creating sediments, moving them across the landscape, and ultimately depositing them in a lake or a delta in a shallow sea where they eventually get fused into rocks. So this process of sediments getting created, emptying into some body of water, fusing into some kind of sedimentary rock, and then creating formations that are ultimately then eroded again means that the sedimentary process is really a sedimentary cycle. And a lot of the sand that makes up the American West has been through this process numerous times. which I just think is fascinating. And each of these layers really represents a former world. So the kind of characteristics of a layer, whether it's thick or thin, whether it erodes easily or not, are directly related to the world that laid them down. So you might expect a huge, like, consolidated layer like this to be, you know, heavy sand that was laid down in a time when you had a lot of erosion, really energetic environment. You might expect thinner layers to be silt that was deposited in a quiet ocean far from land. And so as a result, I think that these rock formations have this, like, contained universe of former worlds, whether they were, you know, dry or arid or, like, lush and mountainous, or deserts like they are today. This photo I took craning out of an airplane window, which I often do. I'm religiously a window seat sitter, especially flying between here and, like, Colorado, where I'm from. And this was, like, hands down one of the best views I ever got. It was this crystal clear day. And what I love about this photo is that it really shows the extent to which the West is just so precisely the product of watersheds and the product of the river process. So every single piece of texture you can see in this photo is a watershed in miniature, and watersheds have this amazing fractal nature where, you know, any given piece of land that water flows over and accumulates into can be called a watershed, and obviously they're contained within bigger watersheds and contained within bigger watersheds. So everything on this side of the butte is draining into this single drainage, everything in this entire photo is draining here, and ultimately this will join the Colorado River and be part of the Colorado River watershed. I also think this is cool because it shows the extent to which the sedimentary nature of these landscapes really plays a hand in how they end up looking. So this is a drone panorama taken right next to a mesa, not unlike one of these. So basically, like, what would happen if you flew a drone, like, right here and took a big sweeping panorama. And it really captures this character of sedimentary rocks, which is that they erode differently depending on how they were made. So I couldn't tell you exactly what's happening in this photo, but for whatever reason, the rocks that form this kind of cap of the mesa they're heavily cemented, or they have really, like, closely intertwined grains, and they're really resistant to erosion, whereas the underlying layers are much softer. And they ultimately will, the reason that this mesa will eventually get smaller and disappear is because these underlying layers will be swept away and swept away by erosion. And you see this kind of landscape everywhere in the American West. And the reason that you get such dramatic incisions into the landscape is directly related to the fact that the landscape itself is a series of these kind of variable plates that you know, you'll have a high resistance level, and everything will erode off the top of it until it becomes totally flat, until it needs to erode more, and you get an incision like the Grand Canyon. Now, this next photo in the series speaks to the fate of all those sediments. What happens when all this stuff is getting shipped out somewhere? And in the case of the American West, a lot of it is still here with us. So this is a photo that I took with Maddie on a sedimentology field trip in college. And this hiker is standing amongst the excavated remains of the Grand Canyon. These hills are these clay-rich badlands in the southernmost part of California, basically where the early Colorado River started dumping its sediments as it eroded off the Colorado Plateau and had to put them all somewhere. So in this video, to give us a little context, zooming into the Gulf of California, you can see the trace of the Colorado River right here. And this is where we're talking about. You can see that the Gulf really runs right into this massive plug of sediments that just block the advancement of the sea. And in fact, this entire area, the Gulf of California, which, you know, exists as this kind of like ripped apart looking zone from mainland Mexico, it is literally a rift basin. It's tectonically active, and it's growing in depth all the time. And in fact, this area off to the right here, which is the Salton Sea, sits at more than 200 feet below sea level. And it is only the massive plug of sediments that the Colorado River has laid down here that's preventing the ocean from rushing in and reclaiming this area And that's a good thing because this area is some of the most valuable and productive farmland in the entire world. This is the Mexican-American border coming through right here, and this area alone is called the Imperial Valley Irrigation District, and it grows 80% of all of the produce that Americans eat in the winter.
Huh.
And that is because you have this extremely rich environment built upon the transported sediments of the Colorado River, all of the vitamins and mineral nutrients that are contained within them. And you have 360 days of sunshine in this gorgeous desert, and you have the water of the Colorado River. So, and then over here is somewhere in here is where that picture was taken. And so obviously the Colorado River has this incredibly dramatic impact when seen from space, and it also has this incredibly dramatic impact on the rock record. So this is a cutaway of those same hills from the original photo. This is like there's a creek here that has eroded away this cliffside, and you can kind of imagine the hills like basically off to over there. And what you're seeing here is these layers. This is me for scale. You're seeing these layers, these kind of dramatic layers, and they look somewhat typical as sedimentary layers go, but what is gobsmacking about them is that each one of these layers represents only a single year in geologic time. So you go from just a few miles that way, where the rock record of the Gulf before the Colorado River enters is, and you see sedimentary rocks that record a millimeter, an inch of rock record every millennium, every 1,000 years, this like really slow rate of silt settling out, to a place where you get 6 to 8 inches of sediment laid down in a single spring flood season. So every single one of these is that Colorado River, the snowmelt pulse coming out of the Rockies, running across the Colorado Plateau, sluicing through the Grand Canyon, moving just unfathomable quantities of sediment and laying them out in layers like this. So for the last photo in this section, this is actually the oldest photo in the whole show. Again, taken on a on a college field trip, and that girl right there, I was just starting to date when this photo was taken, and she's now my wife standing over there. This was taken during one of the coolest academic experiences I've ever had, which was this geology field trip where we went in the company of our sedimentology teacher, Bob Gaines. We hiked down Bright Angel Trail from the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and at every layer as we passed through them, our teacher would tell us about the world that each of those layers represented. And he would interpret like the rocks that we were walking through and what they meant about the time in which they were created. And when we got to the bottom, he told us about how the most incredible story, the most dramatic world of all of them is represented not in any of these layers that exist above here, but in what is not preserved in the rock record. So what you're looking at in this transition between these neatly, horizontally layered sedimentary rocks and this gnarly, kind of chunky looking black rock is more than 1 billion years of lost time. And so this is called an unconformity, when you have a time in the rock record where the record jumps time without the intervening time being chronicled or kind of recorded. And this is really like, hands down the most dramatic one in the world. The Great Unconformity has exposures on like all over the planet. You can find it in China, you can find it everywhere, and it records this remarkable period in Earth's history when erosion vastly dominated over deposition. So you have a period in which the land surface started as presumably insanely mountainous, like all rugged, all sorts of texture like we have today, and over a huge period of time, roughly 1 billion years, only erosion was happening for any like long period of time. You basically have the entire land masses of Earth being worn down to smoothness, and all of that material and all of those dissolved minerals were being exported out into Earth's oceans. And that is important because of something called biomineralization, which is the process by which organic things, you and I, shellfish, things in the ocean, create artificial minerals using stuff out of the environment. So in the case of shellfish, like this cephalopod shell here, that is a mineral called calcium carbonate, and it requires calcium that's been dissolved in water to make. And so what you have when you have this massive scheme of erosion, you're populating the ocean with vast, vast quantities of dissolved calcium, among magnesium, sodium, iron, all of the other minerals that are dissolved out of rock. And so it's not a coincidence that directly above the Vishnu schist, which is this metamorphic rock that is 1.5 billion years old, and this first layer that was laid down, which coincided with the Cambrian era, which is about 450 million years ago, that this layer contains these scratching marks, which are trace fossils of some of the first complex life ever to exist on Earth. So the Cambrian era is famous for the Cambrian explosion, which was this period of just like wild, wacky-ass evolution, during which like a huge percentage of the diversity and the variety of living things leapt into being. There was just this like evolution grab bag. Organisms were evolving all these crazy shapes to inhabit niches that had just gone completely unfilled. All of the life prior to the Cambrian explosion was these like funky looking, soft-bodied, like gelatinous organisms. They were just very uninteresting. And part of that was that they had no way of creating structure in their bodies. And so the population of the ocean with the minerals that are required for biomineralization was a necessary precursor and arguably a cause of the Cambrian explosion and the diversity of life on Earth. And what is just even cooler than all of that is that the person who figured that out was my geology teacher, Bob Case. And it was like his scientific claim to fame. So that was truly like the best academic mind blow I've ever experienced. So anyway, between these four photos, they captured the extent to which the evolutionary processes, the erosional processes and the processes that rivers contain are not only active every day in our lives, but have been playing out in pretty much exactly this way for hundreds of millions of years. And that is why the American West looks the way it does. So with that, we move on to part two, which is, now that we've talked about all the ways rivers naturally work, we'll talk about what humans do to that.